begin just by welcoming you to the second session of the Dissenting Traditions Conference. And this session is on what is called, rather, Perspectives on E.P. Thompson. And we have three speakers today, and I will introduce them in a moment. But I'd just like to say something first about E.P. Thompson and Brian Palmer. It perhaps goes without saying that E.P. Thompson played a large role in the making of Brian Palmer as a labour and working class historian. However, while the question of influence is clear, the exact nature of that influence has often been muddied. If Brian learnt much from Thompson about handling historical evidence and about the re-evaluation of forms of experience and education often ignored by academic historiography, he also entered a dialogue of disagreement with Thompson about matters of structure and agency, the relationship between the base and superstructure, and also about socialist strategy. The dialogue was always fraternal and generous, but the points of negotiation and difference were clear. Since Thompson's death, Brian has of course made a major contribution to an assessment of Thompson's historical and political legacy. Once again, that assessment has been based on appreciation and dissent, negotiating all the time the way Thompson's history and politics were being interpreted in often ungenerous ways by others. It is an unfashionable assessment, but one I believe that will endure. Now to our three speakers, and I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who's Nick Rogers. He's the Distinguished Research Professor in the History Department at York University. He has published widely in the history of 18th century English society, with a varied focus on popular politics, crowds, crime and violence, and today he'll be speaking on E.P. Thompson's 18th century.
Thank you, Wade, for that introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here at this conference in honour of Brian. I might say when I first met Brian, it was actually in New York City, I believe, and he showed me around. He'd already been, he'd worked as a teenager or as an early adult in New York, and he knew his way around. And he just finished, I think at the time, or was finishing the making of E.P. Thompson, that wonderful little book that he wrote. So I'm going to talk about Thompson today, but Thompson in the 18th century rather than actually the making particularly, although the books, as I will suggest, are linked. In the early 70s, I attended two lectures at University College London. The first was given by J.H. Plum, quite renowned Cambridge historian, who delivered a talk on the commercialisation of leisure in 18th century England. The second was given by Edward Thompson, recently departed from Warwick, where he was upset by the fusion of academic and business interests. His talk was Patrician Society, Plebeian Culture. At least it was an early version of that essay that eventually was published in 1974. The thrust of the two talks couldn't have been more different. Plum's talk was about modernity, how aristocratic authority was boosted by canny cultural entrepreneurship in the promotion of prize fights and horse racing. And it was about Wedgwood, it was about fashion, it was about shops. It became part of a collaborative book with Neil McKendrick and John Brewer called The Birth of a Consumer Society. And in McKendrick's eyes, at least, it anticipated the mass consumerism of the post-war era. All this was quite anathema to Thompson. To begin with, he deplored the culture of consumerism that had seduced major sections of the public in the 1950s and blunted socialist advance. Second, he was a lot more sceptical about who benefited from the fashionable 18th century and what purchase there was in such a perspective. The consumption that interested Thompson was the one that Wayne talked about, food. Addressing the sensitivity of common people to the availability of basic foodstuffs and their access to common right. He once mischievously noted in one of his essays on this topic, they might have been surprised to learn that they belonged to a consumer society. Thompson had little time for this. Save that, with one exception, it stimulated through newspapers, coffee houses, clubs and societies, a public sphere of discussion and debate. He did concede on that one. But he also had little time for the then alternative, the great house vision of the 18th century, with the country house at the apex and the lines of communication running to the dining room, the estate office, and to the kennels. This vision of England had and continues to have considerable cultural purchase, now replicated in interminable episodes of Downton Abbey. The vision evokes traditions of noblesse oblige, hierarchy, deference, obligation, gracious living, extended kinship, and so on. It was a literary trope of considerable importance, portraying the countryside as a place of repose and civilization in contrast to the bustle of industry, a theme that Raymond Williams addressed in The Country and the City. It also framed Laslet's The World We Have Lost, where he talked about pre-industrial England as a one-class society, and also Harold Perkin, the first professor of social history in Britain, actually, who used the same model in his preface to The Origins of Modern English Society. Now, Thompson thought this paternalist model was altogether too cosy, sentimental, and historically inspecific. It needed decoding, particularly the tension, but whereas Williams, in The Country and the City, exposed the influx of new money into the countryside as a way of puncturing the mystique of gentry rule, Thompson stressed the role of the landed class as agrarian capitalists, devoted to improving their estates and solicitous of finding improving tenants. The tensions between the landed gentleman as paternalist and improver found expression in the laws surrounding grain, which on the one hand upheld the statutes of consumer protection, and yet in times of better harvests encouraged the export of grain. In times of scarcity, landed gentlemen found themselves prisoners of their own paternalist rhetoric and of plebeian crowds who demanded legal action against profiteers, preventing supplies leaving their region and sometimes selling the grain themselves for a just price. You know all about this. This is the moral economy. It's interesting to emphasize the number of recorded incidents that we've now found of this kind of these incidences. Probably 900 throughout the second half of the 18th century. And to Thompson, this testified the fragility of patrician rule, though not, Thompson judged, and this is important, a fundamental challenge to it. Even so, top-down theories of paternalism didn't work. Thompson used the Gramscian concept of hegemony to define the state of play, the equilibrium of forces between patricians and plebs, which in the revolutionary decade threatened to become a major crisis of confidence in the Georgian regime. Plebeian culture for Thompson was not revolutionary. It was a conservative, rebellious culture with high expectations of customary rights. The ideological challenge to Georgian rule came from dissenting artisans like Blake, who inherited the antinomian tradition of the 17th century, and the visionary Jacobins and Romantics who aspired to égalité. And in his later years, Thompson actually returned to this in Witness to the Beast and in a collection of essays on Wordsworth, Thelwall, and Coleridge called The Romantics. So, Edward's time at the Centre for Social History, he was there between 1965 and 71, was devoted to exploring the relationship of custom to class in the 18th century. This has sometimes been seen as merely a postscript to the making. Scott Hamilton's recent book on Thompson hardly mentions his contributions to the 18th century, and I think overlooks their theoretical import. It is true, of course, that Thompson made his reputation with his second book, The Making, which engendered a lot of theoretical discussion about the nature of class, the place of experience in class formation, particularly in the wake of the Anglophone reception of post-structuralist French theory. Thompson's 18th century writings lacked that moment of historical ferment. The 18th century material came out spasmodically, interrupted by Thompson's own return to political activism with End. And the one monograph that came out of the work, Wigs and Hunters, is in some respects a book for specialists. Nonetheless, this project by Thompson and by his students at Warwick made important contributions to our understanding of how customary perquisites and rights were whittled down by capitalist imperatives, and how critical the law was in both defining those rights and sometimes redefining them as crimes. In detailing this process and the manner in which it was contested, this enterprise threw new light on the transition debate, which had been largely preoccupied with the problem of how feudalism collapsed and capitalism began. And that debate, even for Marxists, often concluded with the Civil War of the mid-17th century, where it was generally agreed there was a breakthrough in capitalism. But how complete that transition was by the late 17th century remained a contentious point. Marx believed it was in the 18th century that witnessed the final stages of what he called primitive accumulation, the divorce of the producer from the means of production. In his view, the expropriation of the peasant was not complete until the second wave of enclosure after 1760. And for a long time, this was the accepted Marxist position, buttressed by evidence from Maurice Dobb and also by R.H. Tawney and even liberal radicals like the Hammonds. But a new generation of rural historians disputed this catastrophic view of enclosure to a point where the Marxist consensus collapsed. This was evident in the way Marxists dated the disappearance of the peasantry. For Brenner, it's 1700. For Hobsbawm, it's first 1790, and then by Captain Spring, it's 1750. Well, you might think there's a lot of quibbling about here, but it's rather crucial dating if you're interested in the dynamics of primitive accumulation. Was capitalism in place by 1700, as Brenner and quite possibly Ellen Wood would argue, or was its progress more protracted and more contentious? The Warwick answer was the latter. In one wide-ranging essay, Custom, Law and Common Right, Thompson documented the keen interest shown by both agrarian and urban commoners to rights of pasture, gleaning, access to fuel in the forests and wildlife, and how customs associated with specific places became redefined in the courts. There's a wonderful section on case law, which was mind-bogglingly difficult, I found, when I was reading it. I didn't know all the terms. How the courts defined use rights as commodities to be bought and sold, marginalising the process, the subsistence economies of the poor. And the reification of usages as properties came to a climax with enclosure, and the Warwick School made a lot of that, particularly Jeanette Neeson in her book Commoners. Commoners strove hard to hold on to their customary economies, just as industrial artisans tried to preserve the customs of the trade through controlled apprenticeships, combinations, riots, and selective appeals to the Tudor Labour Code. So what's distinctively original is their contribution to the transition debate and to the interplay of law, custom, and labour in these disputes. Plebeians were not simply victims of legal codes that privileged property and the propertied, although the full majesty of the law was often brought to bear on ringleaders of riot. Wherever possible, they sought to mobilise the law to advantage, because protective labour and consumer legislation was there to be invoked, and because the law was imbricated in productive processes. Indeed, Thompson argued that religious and moral imperatives were inextricably enmeshed in economic means, a position that reinforced his distaste for the base superstructure argument, model of Marx's interpretation. To quote him, "We cannot even begin to describe feudal or capitalist society in economic terms. Independently of the relations of power and domination, the concepts of use right or private ownership, the culturally endorsed norms and culturally formed needs characteristic of the mode of production. Such statements led some to suspect that his soft, multifaceted determinism wasn't really Marxist at all. And at one point, Thompson mischievously noted at a conference at Columbia that he was one of a kind, a Muggletonian Marxist, he said. So, Thompson made this important contribution, and it was very wide-ranging. Customs in Common, sadly a book, I think, that was really interrupted in some ways by his illness. It was cobbled together a little bit, you might say. Still has a lot to say, not only about protest, but also about what Pierre Bourdieu would call habitus, the lived environment, inherited expectations, rules, norms, and sanctions that are important in society. They include, of course, the classic essay on work, time and work discipline, the flip side of which, of course, is the degree to which the cottage economy and commoners themselves had a measure of autonomy to labour at their own pace. They also included essays on the cultural resources of the poor, the use of rough music to discipline transgressors, the more controversial sale of wives, an ostentatiously patriarchal ritual that underwrote popular divorce. The collection was interestingly subtitled A Companion to the Making, and it is something of a coda, I think, revealing clear lines of lineage to the classic text. And it was the combination of research that Thompson really did in the late 60s and 70s. It does, however, reveal points of contention with other historians over the meaning of the 18th century that I'd like to talk about, particularly this patrician plebeian dyad, which Thompson saw as a magnetic field. Patricians on one side, one pole, the plebeians on the other, and then there are iron filings in between, levels of dependency, if you like. In some ways, this vision is decidedly rural. There are good reasons for this. 75% of the English population lived in rural settings, and the transition debate that engaged him was over the struggle for agrarian customary rights, really. At the same time, you could look at it the flip side. If 25% are living in urban areas, Britain is actually urbanising faster than probably anybody save Holland. London is becoming a huge imperial metropolis, 1 million by 1811, and really in the 18th century, Britain is on the world stage, mobilising capital for war, commerce and empire, crucial factors undergirding Britain's industrial preeminence in the 19th century. Thompson was aware to some degree of these developments. In the revised essay in Customs in Common on the plebeians and the patricians, he said, "I will pass over a great deal that lies in between commerce, manufacture, London's labouring trades, overseas empire." This is rather a lot to pass over, it seems to me. It begs certain questions that I don't think Thompson was prepared really to handle at that point. The relationship of the state to class power, for example. And at the secondary level, the relationship of parish to landed society, especially since middling tradesmen and farmers were directly responsible for the administration of basic welfare, the poor laws as they're called in England, even if appeals against their decisions could be heard at the Quarter Sessions. And it's extremely debatable in some ways whether the great merchants and financiers can be simply discounted as clients, which the model would presume. Especially those like the merchant venturers of Bristol, who had a heavy investment in civic life, and indeed the big freeman boroughs of the 18th century were quite politically independent. I could go into the debates about why he ignores the middling class. I mean, in many ways he would say they are dependents of a larger, in many ways, a sort of parasitism. The state became a kind of parasitism. But I want to actually pursue this a little further in the context, and I'm going to really end with this, of primitive accumulation, the problematic that Thompson actually addressed. Towards the end of Capital, in Volume 1, it's actually chapter 31, I think, Marx noted that the modern fiscal system of the late 17th century was one of the most powerful levers of primitive accumulation, because renewed demands for taxation to pay for the national debt fell increasingly on the subaltern classes, eroding subsistence economies and making workers more wage dependent. And we know that British taxes on commodities like tea, candles, salt, soap were very efficiently levied, more efficiently actually than in France. And I think this is a problem for the patrician plebeian diet. Within the ruling bloc there are simply more players. The power of quintessential patricians, the landed aristocracy, has to be tempered by high finance, merchant oligarchies and manufacturing lobbies. And once we recognise that Britain was an ascendant imperial power in the 18th century, from 1740 to 1815 at war 2 in every 3 years, then other forms of popular contention come into play and cast a different light on the dynamics of protest. War generated over 600 anti-impressment riots and affrays against forcible recruitment into the Navy, incidents that were often triangulated contests between the Admiralty, civic authorities and the sailors. It generated patriotic effusions that ran the gamut of populism, sometimes in the service of the establishment, sometimes not, sometimes in support of libertarian heroes who dared condemn peace settlements. John Wilkes, that's what he got into trouble initially about in the North Britain number 45, sometimes showing the uglier side of the Englishman's birthright, sacking Catholic chapels in the Gordon riots of 1780 in protest of modern concessions to Catholics at home and larger ones in Quebec. Thompson had trouble with the political volatility of 18th century crowds. He tended to write off the ones that didn't fit as client-driven. Now, I want to just talk a little bit about this finally in terms of Wigs and Hunters, which is a brilliant historical exploration of the battle over customary rights and privileges in the forests of Berkshire and Hampshire during the 1720s, which gave rise to a draconian piece of legislation, the Wolf and Black Act of 1726, which in one stroke put 50 new capital offences on the books, ranging from appearing in disguise, blacking, maiming cattle, cutting down trees, poaching deer, writing anonymous letters. Among the promoters of this draconian piece of legislation was Sir Robert Walpole, whose allies and king had their parks raided by deer poachers and their fish ponds smashed. Plum had applauded Walpole as the architect of political stability. Thompson damned him as the architect of old corruption, an exponent of political cronyism whose style of rule, he said, had something of the sick quality of a banana republic. The rhetorical force of this blasphemy certainly bothered Plum. But there is a sense in which Walpole was more than a racketeer, just as Britain was more than a dependent colony. Walpole had, after all, reconstructed the national debt after the chaos of the South Sea bubble. He began to redistribute taxes away from the landed gentry to the working poor. He was extremely useful, in other words, to landed gentlemen who wanted to keep up their rent rolls. Thompson generalised out of the Black episode using Swift and Pope as his mentors. And I think, but I think that might have taken him a little bit off track because it focuses too much on the racketeering. Wigs and Hunters is a marvellous foray in micro-history in which the complexities of customary use rights and the hard battles over them are richly relayed. It could have been even better, I'm arguing, had Thompson generalised not simply on the importance of the rule of law in checking and exposing the arbitrary authoritarian impulses of the rulers, that classic last chapter in the book, but how the state was brought into play to prepare commoners for full throttle capitalism. Thank you.